Okay, look at that. We can do the comments. All right. As I said, topic of today's live stream is identity, personal identity, identity crises, how we consider ourselves and the way that we move through the world as people who think. I mean, that's a really weird thing that humans do. We are creatures that consider ourselves as creatures walking through the world. Our ability to kind of see ourselves in third person is really, really interesting, and it's been a curiosity for psychology and for philosophers for a long, long time. But let's not go into the philosophy or psychology or metaphysics or any of that stuff. Let's just talk about how it actually affects us. So here's my little rant. 3 times in my life so far, I've gone through what I would consider an identity crisis, which, given my age, works out to about once per decade on average, even though they pretty much all happened within the span of 15 years. So they didn't actually happen once per decade. I didn't have any crises the first 15 years of my life. There were no identity crises then. It'd be weird to be like having an identity crisis before you even discovered who you are yet. But anyway, first crisis I really went through was when I went to college for the first time. I went to college, as most of you know, for audio engineering, for music. I was a music industry major with an audio engineering specialty or concentration. Now, even within that, there was something of a little crisis that I had before I even got to the college where I attended, which was I originally wanted to go to Berklee College of Music in Boston, which is like the not preliminary, the best, most prestigious contemporary music school in America, at least, if not North America. So I did. I worked really hard for about 6 months with my guitar teacher, running through scales and learning theory and really getting everything down. And I was a pretty good guitarist. And my family had to drive all the way from Buffalo to Boston, which I guess, as I'm saying that out loud, wasn't that bad because people have to fly in to do music auditions. I remember when my brother auditioned on bass guitar for one of his music schools, he had to fly from Buffalo to Texas. But we drove from Buffalo to Boston, where Berklee College of Music is, and I auditioned, and I got in, which was ridiculous. I couldn't believe it. I got into Berklee. Now, I think at the time, 2,000 guitarists applied every fall, and they only accepted 1 to 200 new ones. And so I got accepted, and I waited and waited and waited to find out what the financial package was going to be. And I was offered a $12,000 a year scholarship, which sounds like a lot of money. Until my dad put the piece of paper in front of my face and showed me what it actually costs to go to Berklee College of Music. And in those days, it cost $52,000 a year. Now I think it's well over 60. So it's 52 grand a year. 12 grand a year in scholarships brings that down to 40 grand a year for 4 years. I remember looking at that piece of paper, and even at 17, understanding that if you go 100 and was it 40 grand a year for 4 years, $160,000 in debt, and come out at the other side with a degree in electric rock guitar, you're probably screwed for life. So I really got kind of crushed by that because I had been wanting to go to Berklee. That was my dream. But I chose to go to a state school on basically a full scholarship instead. It was actually an academic scholarship, but because it was a state college and it was a liberal arts college, they didn't really care what I went for. The scholarship was just for going there. So my scholarship was for my grades, but I went for music. My scholarship had nothing to do with music. So I attended college for audio engineering. And this was what happened. In my first semester, I immediately hooked up with a couple of other guys and formed a band. And this was happening all over the place. Every music major was finding other musicians and forming bands and starting to play out in local clubs and gigs and on campus and at open mics and all that stuff. That was the goal. Our professors encouraged us to do that, of course. And the more I was around other guitarists, the more discouraged I got. I was a really good guitarist. I mean, I was for 17, for the age, and the fact that I only got into guitar at the age of 13, which was, well, 12 maybe, which is really late for when you think about people who are the top of their field when it comes to music, usually they start 3, 4, 5 years old. I started like 12, but I got really good, or at least so I thought, until I was around all of these music majors and musicians and guitarists. See, at my high school, I was the best guitarist in my school. There was no contest. Hardly anybody else played guitar at all, and I was easily 10 times better than the next best guitarist at the school. And even in my community, when I did local battle of guitarists and stuff like that, like I was in my age group, I was always a big fish in a small pond. I was the next Eddie Van Halen. But then I went to music school, and everyone, the person to your left and right, no matter what room you're in, is as good, if not better than you. Most of the people that I was interacting with on a daily basis were far better musicians than me. Every guitarist was amazing, and most of them were even more amazing than I was. And that was really discouraging. And this is a rant. This goes into a tangent for a different time, but there's been a lot of science and psychology over the last few years that shows that people who are a big fish in a small pond actually end up being more successful later in life. That if you're in the upper echelon of a lower tier, in other words, if you go to a state school and you're like in the top 5% of students in your state school, you're going to be much more successful than going to Harvard or Yale, but being in the lowest 10%. So you can get a lesser education, but the fact that you're the smartest one in any room, even though you're in rooms of generally less smart people, right? It leads to success later in life because of the confidence you build from being the smartest person or the best guitarist in every room or the best artist or whatever. Anyway, ran for a different time. So what happened was I was around all these guitarists who were incredible, so much better than me, and I realized what it would take to go and become as good as they were. And I didn't want to work that hard. I just really didn't want to work that hard. And so I know that sounds crazy because of what I do now. I work like round the clock 24/7, but that moment became a real crisis for me. I realized I'm not going to be as good as they are because I'm not willing to do the work that they are doing and that they've done. So then who am I? Because I had identified as a guitarist for the last 5 or 6 years of my life. I was a guitarist. I was going to be a rock star. But suddenly that was stripped away from me by comparison. And so I dropped the music major. I became a math major and eventually a philosophy major. And philosophy is where I really found myself then. I loved philosophy. As you all know, I got really obsessed with it and just exploded. I did the entire major in just about 3 semesters with a couple of summer independent studies. In that time, in just junior and senior year at college, I only was a philosophy major for 2 years, but I won a bunch of international awards for papers and presentations, and I got accepted into a PhD program for philosophy of language straight out of undergrad, which is a huge, that was a big deal. And so I was like, now I was a philosopher, right? In my head, I had spent the last couple of years just immersed in this world of philosophy. And so then I decided I was going to, do a PhD. But in the few months leading up to graduating college, I realized that I wanted to try to make a living as a magician instead. I was staring down 7 more years of school, right? 4 years to get an undergraduate degree. And then it's an average of 7 more years from that point to get a PhD. You get your master's along the way, and then it takes 3 to 5 years to do the thesis, to do your PhD. And most people who start PhDs never do them. They drop at some point. Most people who start them don't actually get a PhD. They end up dropping with a terminal master's, which is no small feat. But staring down 7 more years of my life, I thought, this silly thing that has permeated my whole life, all the way from when I was a kid, all the way through the guitar phase, all the way through the engineering phase, all the way through the math and philosophy phase, magic, which I had used to make money to support myself through college. Most of what I was doing was on scholarship, so I didn't pay for tuition with magic tricks, but everything else I covered: my car, my phone, my food, all that stuff. So I decided at the last hour to turn down to turn down the PhD offers, and because I wanted to do card tricks for a living, which was a really rough phone call home to mom and dad, who are both computer scientists. My dad's a PhD. And so here's the second major crisis. So I had originally seen myself as a guitarist. It's the next Eddie Van Halen, and then that was stripped away from me. So then I saw myself as a philosopher. And then I decided, this one I chose to pursue magic and make that my identity. So that was my second real crisis. Now I'm not an academic. I'd been trained all my life because of my parents. I'd been led into this world of academia. They were bringing me along, nurturing me, assuming someday I would either be a professor or a computer scientist or a mathematician or something like that. So now this thing I've been led towards for 21 years, I decided, nope, I'm going to do magic, art, card tricks. So here's my next crisis. But then I really embraced that. I loved being a magician. Man, I loved being a magician. I loved when people would ask what I did. I would say, I'm a magician. And they would go, oh, what? And they had all these follow-up questions that they would ask me about, being a magician. And they had this idea, maybe they assumed I did shows for kids, which of course I didn't. I was doing colleges and corporate events. And I loved being a magician. And even though when I was out with my friends, I acted annoyed when someone asked me to do a trick, I kind of loved it. You know what I mean? Like I acted annoyed, but I kind of loved the attention. So then I built my career as a magician and got relatively successful. I mean, I did the starving artist thing for a few years, but I pursued it, got a couple of lucky breaks, and I made it. I was touring nationally and doing a little bit of international work, and got, as I like to say, about as successful as you can be as a magician without being famous. So I was supporting myself, and then I was supporting Lindsay, who's now my wife. I got to support her through her master's, and tell her she didn't need to work. She didn't need to contribute to the finances. I was able to cover both of us while she did her master's for 3.5 years, which was my proudest accomplishment, much more so than any standing ovation or anything else I'd ever had. So I was really proud of that, and I was a magician. That's who I was. I lived and breathed magic. I would say 80% of every conversation I had in my adult life, in my professional life, had revolved around magic in some capacity. And then I gave the TEDx talk that blew up my world. Now, my goal when I got invited to give a TEDx talk was simply to be able to increase my rates as a magician. That was my goal, to increase my rates as a magician. That's all I wanted to do. I wanted to give a talk that I was hoping it would get 10,000 views. 5,000 was fine. If I could get 10,000, if I could just scrape together 10,000 views, I could raise my rates by $500. That's what I was thinking. And as you know, 3 million views later, the viral success is it's insane. To this day, I don't understand what happened. And I'm sure I never really will. Some combination of the title, How to Magically Connect with Anyone. The thumbnail was like a fedora-wearing goofball in a suit. Like I had a fedora on and a suit and a goatee. And the title was about magic and connecting. And then it was also in 2015 when the whole world took this really weird right turn into this kind of divisive, distracted age that we're currently living in. So here you have, like I said, like a fedora-wearing goofball in a suit who was a magician talking about connecting with people, and it just blew up. And so when it only had like 500,000 views, when it had 500,000 views, I was already getting calls from organizations all over the world to come speak. And so overnight, I went from being a relatively successful magician to being an international expert, authority, thought leader on connecting with people. Now, I wasn't any of those things. I wasn't an expert. I wasn't an authority. I wasn't a thought leader. I had exactly 14 minutes and 11 seconds to say about that particular topic. And I said it all in the TEDx talk. But when I started getting invited and started getting offered these really obscenely high fees, I mean, to me, in the speaking world at the time, it turns out they were actually really low. But to me, they were 5 times, 10 times what I was getting paid as a magician, even though in the speaking world, I didn't realize how low they were. It sent me into a crisis, a complete identity spiral, because every conversation I had at that point, people saw magician as who I used to be, as something I used to do, not who I was. They saw magic as this interesting artifact, this interesting leftover piece from my prior career, the thing that made me kind of a cool thing to have at their conference. But I wasn't a magician to them. I was a thought leader. I was an author. Or not an author at the time. I was an expert, an authority on connecting with people and perspectives who used to be a magician. Interesting tidbit. And I really didn't know how to handle that because I didn't feel any different. I was a magician. I knew I wasn't an expert, an authority, a thought leader, but that was what I needed to inhabit in my head. And I needed to carry myself as if I was one in order to go do these events and to deliver on the promise that I was making to these clients. So it took years, and I mean, it probably took until about a year ago for me to really start to see myself in that light. For the last 4 years since the TED Talk, the TEDx Talk, if you want to be super technical, for the last 4 years, I've been, publishing a weekly blog. I now run a bi-weekly podcast that I've kind of shifted to a weekly podcast. I started producing more videos about these topics. I started writing, emails and speaking constantly. Hundreds of events I spoke at. I read voraciously. I read probably, I was going to say hundreds, dozens at least, dozens of books on the topic, hundreds of articles and blog posts and videos, everything I could get my hands on the topic of human connection as related to psychology and philosophy and sociology and anthropology and history and all these different things. And so I immersed myself for years. And it's just about a year ago that when people would introduce me as an authority, as an expert, as a thought leader, I finally was able to see myself the way they saw me, because I have this huge depth, this huge wealth of not just knowledge and information, but of content that I've produced, my own thoughts that I've put into the world consistently. And so now I can walk through the world as that person. But it took a lot of work and a lot of effort and a lot of time, and it took a leap. My favorite quote of all time is "Leap and the net will appear." And that really is what I had to do for this most recent identity crisis kind of shift. So from guitarist to magician, from magician to philosopher, from philosopher to thought leader is technically what I'm, we know that's ridiculous. The term thought leader is ridiculous. Nobody's really a thought leader on anything. We're all learning perpetually and forever. And we should be students. We should always be students. And I am, but I think it's that mindset that I recognize now. I'm a lifelong learner. I will always be a student of connection. So I get to be a teacher of human connection and a student at the same time. And it's because I learn so voraciously and so often that I can really see myself as a teacher, because I'm not just learning, I'm not just passively consuming, I'm also writing and speaking and conversing and debating on the topic of human connection. And so, having said all that, thank you for listening to this 21-minute rant on identity. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Have you gone through an identity crisis? In a couple episodes ago, my guest Tim David on the podcast, on the One New Person podcast, we were talking about identity a little bit, where we were mentioning what happens to people who used to hold like prestigious job titles or fancy job titles like CEO, or like inherently interesting positions like NFL linebacker. When they leave those positions or retire or get fired, they really struggle to cope with not having that title anymore. And it's just so easy to let your job dictate your identity. But this week on the podcast, and I know some of you have already watched some of the clips I've put out here on the channel. If you haven't seen them yet, you got to go watch or listen to. My guest this week was Jay Reynolds. Jay is a good friend of mine. He's become a good friend over the last decade. I'm very close with his family and his kids, who see me as sort of an older cousin or maybe a fun uncle kind of a figure now. Um, Jay is one of the most recognizable voices in all of sports because for over 20 years he has anchored ESPN Sports Center Radio. He's the voice of ESPN Sports Center Radio. And it's incredible, but he's not on camera ever, ever, ever. He didn't even have a headshot. When I asked him for a headshot for the thumbnail for the podcast, he said the most recent headshot he had was probably 20 years ago. So I took a photo of him in his studio at ESPN. He gave me a behind the scenes tour of ESPN, which was amazing. And the studio and all that stuff. I got to stand in all those rooms, even if you're not into sports. I mean, it was super, super cool. But I took the photo, the headshot that I used for the thumbnail. So he's not on camera. So even his diehard fans, people who've been listening to him on the radio and trust him as a voice, as an authority, as a personality in sports, probably wouldn't know it if they were standing in line next to him at Starbucks. And so we were talking about the issue of identity, and he told me a couple of different stories that are in the clip from today's episode. So if I put a clip from the episode up today, if you go look at that when we're done with this live stream, you'll see him tell at least one of those stories of, or maybe two of those stories of times when he realized that he's more likely to be recognized for being a dad in the local community, for being a guy at the store, for being one of the parents that speaks up at school board meetings or community town halls. He's more likely and has been recognized more often for that than for being on ESPN on 500 radio stations simultaneously to hundreds of thousands or millions of listeners across the globe. And he said something when we recorded the conversation. He said something that just hit me the right way at the right time. He said he realized that ESPN is his job. It's what he does, but it's not who he is. And I was like, yes, yes, yes. Our job is just that, our job. And if we're lucky, we love our job. And if we're lucky, we get to take the things that are who we are and infuse them into our job. But what we do is not who we are. And we have to remember that who we are is a collection of values and beliefs and ideals and philosophies and experiences and perspectives. But more importantly, who we are is how we act on those values and beliefs and perspectives and ideals and experiences. How you act on them is what matters. And so I have considered myself now incredibly lucky to be able to have a job that so closely aligns with my beliefs and my values, my belief in a world where everyone feels heard, understood, and valued, where we can show up on a daily basis, look people in the eye and say, I hear you, I see you, and I'm here for you. I believe in that world, and I get to express that now more than ever with the current job that I have as a thought leader, by writing a blog and running a podcast and giving speeches and doing coaching, and doing consulting. It's wonderful. So thank you for listening to this rant. I see a couple of questions have come through over the next few minutes. I'll take a look at some of these. All right, who we've got here? Oh man, everybody's in here. Diana, it's so nice to see you if you're still here. Mark, thank you for being here. Wayne, your room looks good now. Thanks for saying the room looks good. The very next video in the studio rebuild series is showing you the entire process of putting up all the acoustic panels. Those are going to go. That video goes up Tuesday, and that will be the first of 3 videos in a row that are a collaboration with GIK Acoustics. Those are sponsored videos, but that one goes up Tuesday. Thank you for that. So Diana, great to see you. Ben, always good to see you. Shay, thanks for being here. Dr. Shriek, oh man, I always get this. Hegday, Dr. Hegday, nice to see you. Mark asks, do you still suffer from imposter syndrome, and how do you work through it? Great question, Mark. Do I still suffer from imposter syndrome? Yes, but not nearly as much as I did at the beginning of this, at the transition from magic to this. As far as I can tell, the key to overcoming imposter syndrome is to master whatever it is that you're doing. Arrogance is born out of insecurity, right? A lot of young people, and when we first get into fields, we're mostly all guilty of this at some point. When we're young or inexperienced, we manifest that inexperience, that insecurity over the fact that we don't know that much, that we don't have a lot of experience, that we don't have a lot of years in the field. That tends to manifest as ego, as arrogance. Really, it's just a smokescreen. It's a wall that we put up to protect ourselves, right? So like, arrogance is born of insecurity, but confidence is born from experience. The more you know and firsthand about whatever it is you're doing, the more confident you will be in doing that thing. Now that sounds like an obvious thing to say, but it's phenomenally difficult to do. So the fact that I have spent the last 4 years now completely immersed in the study of human connection across a variety of fields, not just as I said, as a passive consumer, but also writing constantly, speaking constantly, conversing, debating on these topics and these ideas. It makes me feel like I now have just a huge wealth of interesting tidbits and stories and facts and psychology to draw on when I'm giving a talk. So no, I do feel imposter syndrome. I always feel it a little bit because I'm not, I mean, who's really an expert on human connection? What does that even mean, right? I make all the same mistakes as the people I'm speaking to in my audiences, as the people I'm coaching, as the people I consult for. But where my expertise comes from, and the reason that I've been able to push aside the imposter syndrome a little bit, is in the fact that when I make those mistakes, I am very aware of how I made them and why I made them, and I'm much more likely to head off one of those mistakes right as it starts bubbling. As I start to make a mistake, I'm much better at catching it, recognizing it, and I know how to move forward through it. And that's where the expert status comes from, is that. Merely the ability to recognize mistakes in any field. If you're an engineer, if you're a philosopher, if a computer scientist, if you are a receptionist, merely the ability to recognize your own mistakes as they happen and correct for them sets you well above the average person who doesn't do what you do for a living, who doesn't have the experience and the expertise that you do. So Mark, to finish that question, yes, I still suffer from imposter syndrome, but it's much easier for me to now take that and put it in a corner, to put it to the side so I can do my work. I think that's the goal. Seth Godin likes to say, people who finish marathons, it's not that they don't get tired, it's that they figured out where to put the tired, right? For me to do my job, I just have to, it's not that I don't get imposter syndrome. I've just figured out where to put the imposter syndrome. I know how to put it off to the side to do my job and deliver on the promise I make to my audiences. And then it creeps back in the other times. So I hope that answers your question. John, what you do in your career is a result of choices you make. Yes, you can often change your career to align with your values. It takes planning and time. Beautifully said, John. Yes, you can often change your career to align with your values. It just takes planning and time. This is such a good point. Thank you for bringing this up. It is so much easier to choose to love what you do than to try to go find a job that you love. I'm going to let that sink in for a second, right? If you're doing a job that you've got it in your head, you hate your job, or you don't like your job. A lot of people like that have felt that way in many different jobs. Now, maybe your job is particularly bad, right? So there's always exceptions, but more often than not, it is a mindset. It's a decision that I'm going to love my job. So I'm going to find the aspects of my job where I get to infuse my values, I get to infuse my beliefs and my philosophies, and I'm going to really hone in and double down on those aspects of my job. And then there's other aspects of every job, mine included. When I was a magician, there was a lot of crap that I had to deal with. Every job's got downsides, but the ability to choose. This goes back to the myth of Sisyphus, right? The myth of Sisyphus, right? Sisyphus was condemned by the gods to an eternity of rolling a boulder up a hill. That's a myth that's designed to teach us about humility. But Albert Camus, the great existentialist philosopher, wrote a whole book called The Myth of Sisyphus, where he discussed, where he basically said Sisyphus is a hero. He says he's the absurd hero, where in coming into contact with the absurdity of existence, the fact that he's got to roll a boulder up a hill over and over and over again for all of eternity, and every time he gets it to the top, it rolls back down, he goes, Sisyphus is free. In fact, we must imagine Sisyphus is happy, because in the walk back down the hill to start over, he gets to consider how he feels about his work. He gets to think about his work and see the work he does, the pushing the boulder up a hill forever and ever. He gets to view it in whatever light he wants. And so Camus said, in that way, we must imagine Sisyphus is happy. My favorite line from that book is, the rock is his thing, right? And so we think about Sisyphus with his rock, with his boulder. You can make your job your thing. Decide to take that thing and love it and find the aspects of it that are beautiful and wonderful, and the aspects of your job that have the freedom to take your values and infuse them, because not every aspect of every job can you do that with. But if you are working the front counter at McDonald's, a job that a lot of people would not want to do, and for those of us who've worked at McDonald's, only job I ever had when I was 16, it's a job I have so much respect for, because I did it, and it was the hardest thing I've ever done, was working at fast food. So we look at those jobs and we go, man, that sucks, right? That's our instinct. And people who work in those jobs are like, yeah, this job sucks. But let's say you work the front counter at McDonald's and everyone around you is telling you your job sucks. And even you have those days where you're like, yeah, this job kind of sucks. You can choose to make that job your thing. You can choose to take the aspect of your job that is the connection with the customer. You can say, okay, yes, there are a lot of angry customers, and this is a very fast-paced job, and I have all these time constraints, and I have to do all these things at once, and then blah, 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 blah. There's all these negative things. But at the end of the day, I've got a human being who's looking for a service. They're looking for something. And I can choose to take that 10-second window that I've got a human being eye to eye with me and make them feel valued, make them feel comfortable, make them feel understood. And you can choose to take that job in those circumstances and find something about it where you can do art, where you can infuse your values, your beliefs. You can take that experience and make it whatever you want. Which is why my favorite question to ask people when I first meet them is not, do you like your job or how did you get into it? But what do you love about your job? Not do you love your job? What do you love about your job? Because it forces us to think really hard about which aspects of our job we have control over and we can insert our identity, our positivity into. I think that's a good place to end. I really, really appreciate Dr. Hegde. Your job is not to do your job. Your job is to see what to do next. Seth Godin, my guru. Yeah. Dr. Hegde, if you haven't listened to my conversation with Seth on this season of the podcast, it was the first episode of the current season of the podcast. Definitely go check that out. onenewperson.com. I'll leave that in the description when I'm done with this live stream too. If you haven't listened to that, it was unbelievable. And if you're a Seth Godin junkie like I am, there's a whole bunch of new stuff in there. He told me one story in particular he says he's never told in public before, which is really fun for people. So anyway, thank you everybody for being here. Go check out this week's episode of One New Person with Jay Reynolds from ESPN. I think you'll really, really enjoy the perspective of somebody like him. He's just a dad and a local guy in the community who happens for his job to be a famous radio personality that no one would recognize. It was a really, really wonderful conversation with a lot of good takeaways. So check that out. onenewperson.com. You can see this week's episode, any previous ones. Subscribe via Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, whatever you like. Pick your poison, as it were. And thanks so much for sticking with me. And always remember that our world is a shared experience. Have a great day, guys.